All right, good day, everyone. Today we are doing lecture 5, and the topic that we are looking at is the Hellenistic world. In your notes, it's recorded as topic 4, it's a Hellenistic world. So far, we have looked at the Greek miracle, right? The emergence of philosophy in ancient Greece, starting with the pre-Socratics. And we have explored a number of the very significant moments in pre-Socratic thinking when, very radical, very creative ideas were expressed, many of them ultimately proving to be very correct with respect to the nature of reality, with respect to the nature of being itself. They were addressing ontological issues. By the time we get to the surface, there was a kind of tiredness with respect to ontological issues. And the thinker of reality began looking at the nature of man himself. Man became the center of their philosophical concerns. When we come to the time of Socrates, we come to the actual blossoming of Greek philosophy. Right? Socrates, as I said, stands out as one of the greatest human beings that ever lived, one of the most amazing thinkers. He was a teacher of Plato, who was a teacher of Aristotle, and that combination created philosophy even as we know it today. So that by the 3rd century, by the 4th century, certainly, we have had the flourishing of Greek philosophy, the establishment of 2 very important philosophical schools in Athens, right? The school of Plato, the Academy, and the school of Aristotle, which was the Lyceum. Very, very significant schools. And certainly it was almost indisputable that Athens was the center of the intellectual world. By that time, Aristotle's student Alexander had conquered most of the then known world, and Greek culture was now spreading, it was spreading enormously. There was no need to impose it on anyone. Most countries accepted it. They recognized the tremendous advantages in being educated by the Greeks. And Greek scholarship therefore spread and began to affect almost every modality of thought, every intellectual system, every religious system was impacted by Greek philosophical thinking. Now, the Greeks dominated the 2nd century. The Greek Empire was based primarily in Syria, its capital at Antioch, and that was run by the Seleucids, and in Egypt, which was run by the Ptolemies. So the Greek Empire had really broken up. It actually broke up into 4 segments, but these 2 major segments, which virtually operated as empires, especially the Syrian Empire, they exerted a considerable amount of influence. They continued their military domination until they were challenged in the 2nd century by the Romans and eventually replaced by the Romans. The Greek Empire really came to an end, a final end in about 31 BC. And many of you most probably will be acquainted with the story of Antony and Cleopatra, and Octavian and Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies in Egypt. The empire fell, and it fell to the Romans, and Rome became the master of the world. By the time Christ was born, Rome was the master of the world, and the Roman emperor, right, had taken over political control of all the countries that were operated by the Greek Empire. But the Romans were no match for the Greeks in terms of intellectual ascendancy, intellectual acumen. And therefore, what we find is that the Romans were happy to learn from the Greeks. They had already been Hellenized. A lot of them had already been Hellenized. And so even though the empire by the first century AD, even though the empire was a Roman empire, the culture was essentially a Hellenistic culture. Greek was the lingua franca. It was within that atmosphere, within that cultural environment that Christianity was born and was nurtured, right? And the primary documents that came out of the Christian church were documents written not in Aramaic, interestingly enough, but written in Greek. So Hellenism, therefore, became the dominant. Hellenism it characterizes the essence of the culture and civilization of and sometimes you refer to the Greco-Roman Empire, because even though it was Roman politically, it was still Greek culturally. Now, a number of very interesting systems of thought developed, and a number of them I'd want to discuss today. Two of them are certainly going to immediately appeal to theology students, because Paul was in direct contact with thinkers in those areas, and Paul responded to some extent and even mentioned them in some of his letters. And those are the Stoics and the Epicureans. So you had Stoicism as a main philosophical movement, in addition to Aristotelianism and Platonism and so on. You had Stoicism and Epicureanism. And you also had some new interesting movements like Neoplatonism, which to a large extent came out of Platonism, but it defined itself by fundamental differences in its ontology. And then you had Manichaeism and Gnosticism. In fact, Gnosticism has a significant relevance to to Christianity. It was certainly one of the new thought systems that had a tremendous impact on the new Christian religion. And so Gnosticism is certainly one of the major thought systems that emerged within that Hellenistic world. And then you had a Hellenized form of Judaism, which I think I may have mentioned before. Hellenized form of Judaism, really something that emerged with the thinkers, Judaic thinkers and the rabbinistic thinkers in Alexandria, which still remained a kind of cultural, technological capital of the empire. So I would want to look at some of those very, very interesting thought systems, right, within the Hellenistic world. Philosophical systems, certainly, and systems that do have a significant bearing and in many instances, a very, very important impact on the development of the Christian faith. Stoicism was a philosophy that emerged in ancient Greece, and its founder was Zeno. I referred to Zeno before when we were talking about, the early ontologists. Zeno could be regarded as one of the early ontologists. He is a man who came up with a range of paradoxes, quandaries, intellectual quandaries, quandaries or paradoxes having to do with things like motion and time and so on. But what is interesting about Stoicism is that Stoicism became much more than an abstract philosophical system, right? It was not just concerned with objective ideas with understanding the reality in which, the thinkers found themselves. It was really a kind of semi-religious system. It never developed a cult. So there was no cultus. So you can't call Stoicism a religion. But in that philosophical system, many people found consolation, answers to their immediate existential concerns, right? The need for happiness, the need for a certain measure of intellectual and spiritual satisfaction, right? The need for a certain kind of normativity, prescriptions and guidelines for moral living, a certain kind of moral normativity. Stoicism provided many of these things, right, to the citizens of the Greco-Roman Empire. And so Stoicism had a tremendous impact. And in fact, when we look at some of the elements of Stoicism, we'll see how much Christianity was affected by Stoic ideas. One of the things about Zeno and about the Stoics is that they generally rejected Plato's system of the transcendent universal. Remember, Plato believed that there was a transcendent realm of intelligible ideas, which was separate and distinct from the natural world, the physical world, and that the objects of the physical world, entities in the physical world, merely mimicked. They were merely an imitation of, a reflection of, an insubstantial, right, reflection of things in the intelligible world. Aristotle rejected that, and Aristotle believed that, you know, what was concrete, what was universal was really the concrete, believed in the concrete universal. The forms that Plato talked about, which he assigned to that intelligible world, Aristotle saw it merely as an aspect, you know, as a quality inherent in the physical reality. So there was a vast difference between Aristotle's and Plato's philosophy. Zeno rejected them all, and Zeno said, no. What we have are, everything exists as universals. The world of reality is the world of universals. That's a very interesting notion, and it became the source of tremendous philosophical debate in the Middle Ages. You were saying that now, when you look at the world in which we live, we see things generally in terms of categories. To use a mathematical term, we see things in terms of sets. Right? Human beings constitute a set, the set of human beings. Chairs constitute a set, the set of chairs. So you have these classes, these categories of objects or entities in the real world, and a number of people assigned to those categories a certain kind of substantiality. They're real. A category is real. That is the essence of Plato's philosophy. Plato is saying that there's something like chairness of the chair. That is the reality, not the individual chairs, which are shadows of that ultimate reality. Zeno said not at all. Those classes that we identify are not they do not constitute an entity in the real world. They do not define the state of things in the real world. And therefore, the real world only is a world of individual objects. All that we are doing is that we are conceptualizing these things. They may be realities in our conceptual world, but they are certainly not realities in the real world. And so that was a fundamental given within the system of the Stoics. So the Stoics believe that experience essentially provides us with knowledge. Our knowledge is based on experience. And the experience that we have are not experience of classes and sets. It is really the experience of individuals. That was not a rejection of reason. You know, Plato was a great rationalist, not because there was an opposition to the Platonic system, the notion of the intelligible realm. Did Zeno reject the notion of the centrality of reason as a guide in human consciousness and human life? And so he insisted on the importance of reason. In fact, he believed that reason characterized the structure and the nature of reality. The reality in which we live is really a rational whole. And that's a very important idea. In Greek, the Greek word that was used to define that was the logos. The logos, L-O-G-O-S. The logos was the reality, a reality that defined the nature of the entire cosmos, of the entire universe. It held it together. It explained the harmony that existed in the natural world. And that harmony is a harmony that should be characterized even in the life of the individual. The individual ought to live a life that is in harmony with that, with the logos of the natural world, in harmony with nature itself. He saw the Logos as the world soul. It's the soul of the world. That's an important notion, and it becomes of central importance to the Christian faith, because the writer of the fourth gospel begins his gospel with that. In the beginning was the Logos. Remember, he's writing in Greek. He's taken that term directly from Stoicism. And he's trying to reach a Stoic audience, an audience that is influenced by Stoic ideas. And so he uses the concept of the Logos not only to identify the nature of God himself, which he was really identifying with the world soul, but he was saying that Christ himself was an incarnation of that Logos, right? So you can see the interesting kind of intellectual, gymnastics that was taking place in the ancient world. People were borrowing ideas from all around and building their systems. And if the Christians had to be successful, right, in a pagan world, then they had to recognize what were the fundamental ideas and beliefs of the pagans and work their system around that. In a way, it's very similar to Paul's discussion of the unknown God in ancient Athens. He sees a shrine to the unknown God, and he says, I'm going to talk about that God, right? And he points them to Christ. It's the same kind of thing that is happening in John, right? And the thing about Stoicism is that Stoicism has such a powerful moral character, powerful moral force, that you would find that a number of Christian thinkers would gravitate to the ideas in the Stoic world. The Stoics believed that fire, they accepted the Heraclitean notion that fire was the ultimate reality. And they came up with the notion that ultimately everything will end with fire. That's also a very interesting notion. And that would eventually find its way into Christian eschatology, the notion that everything would be, ultimately destroyed by fire. So you can see the impact that many of these thought systems would have had on Christian theology. Fate and providence, they believe determine the outcome of all things. And so the first people who began to talk about human freedom were the Stoics. Stoics believed that human beings were free. It was a fundamental concept of Stoicism, right? They were talking about human freedom. In fact, a number of Greek philosophies really pointed to and underlined the significance of man being free and therefore capable of making decisions himself, having to take full responsibility for who he is and what he has and what challenges him, so that you find that the notion of human freedom is central to the philosophy of the Stoics. The world, right? The world is not a world with evil in it. They cannot see evil in the world. In fact, there's a sense in which, and later on when we come to, early modern philosophy, we'll see it revisited, this idea revisited. But we live in a world in which evil only exists in the human mind. But from a cosmic standpoint, there is no evil in the universe. We are the ones who bring evil into the universe with our actions or behaviors and so on. But the universe and the way in which it operates is a universe that only demonstrates harmony. It demonstrates that underlying rationality, which is the foundation of its ontological, being. And evil, therefore, is something that really belongs to human intention. It is only insofar as we intend evil that evil exists. Now, again, we see that we see philosophies like that in early Christianity. Christ pointing out, for example, that the evil is not in the act that we perform as much as the intent. Right? If you look at a woman and lust after, you've committed adultery in your heart. Right? So it is not in the act itself, it is in the intent that the evil is contained. So you can see those relationships all the time between those very significant philosophies and the emergent Christian faith that was heavily impacted by those philosophies and that later on came to heavily impact those philosophies. The Stoics were very much concerned with human virtue. They pursued a life of virtue. right? And the cardinal virtues like temperance and moral insight and courage and justice were virtues that they aimed at cultivating in their lives. In fact, the human life should be a life in which we achieve full mastery of ourselves. We overcome the passions. In fact, this is one of the first instances in which we find a negative revalorization of human feeling and human passions. We don't really find it in some of the earlier philosophers, but the Stoics now begin to express, you know, a negative kind of view of feelings and passions. And Christianity eventually radically appropriated that. And we'll see how radical it was when we come to the Middle Ages and the development of Christian asceticism and so on. Now, the Stoics were not ascetics. They did not give up on life, but they were concerned with temperance. Temperance was one of the guiding principles of the Stoic lifestyle. And that temperance and rationality meant that they should seek self-mastery. And self-mastery consisted in the extent to which one was in control of one's feelings, of one's emotions. That became the lower part of human nature. And if you pursue a life where you are able to gain control of feelings, then really and truly you can liberate yourself from the sorrow and the pain and the suffering that many of these feelings bring to human existence, right? You can live a life of apathy. In fact, a state of apathy. Apathy means feelinglessness. You don't have pathos. You don't have feeling. If you can achieve that state of being, then you have really achieved full self-mastery. They believe there's a divine spark in all men. And in fact, the Stoics were among the first people to talk about the brotherhood of man, a tremendous concept. Most of the Greeks, one of the interesting things about the ancient societies is that they were not really racist. But people felt that, you know, one's own nation was better than the nation, other people's nation. You still had prejudices of one type or another. The Stoics said, no, the Logos is the Logos of the entire universe, of the entire cosmos. And therefore, all human beings should be recognized as brothers of that one, sons of that one God, that world soul, right, that characterizes the universe. And so the Stoics advocated the brotherhood of man. They are the ones who came up with a notion of cosmopolitanism. You know, this is for all peoples. And we see Christianity readily adopted that notion later on, right? In fact, in the Old Testament, the only author I can identify in the Old Testament as having that kind of orientation to all nations and all peoples is Isaiah. Isaiah sees Jerusalem ultimately as a place where all peoples will come to worship God. But when you read Ezekiel, Ezekiel says he wants no foreigners near to the temple. You know, most of the Jewish writers are only concerned, especially after the exile, only concerned with the regathering of the lost tribes of the house of Israel. And even, you know, the early Christians were primarily and initially concerned with that restoration of the lost tribes, the reassembling of the lost tribes back in Israel. Christianity soon turned to the Gentiles, and so it became a very cosmopolitan religion. And ultimately, it was Christianity that spread that cosmopolitan notion, that notion of the brotherhood of all men. But the Stoics were the first to articulate that. Clearly, there was some influence exercised by them. So we have, you know, that Stoic philosophy is a very popular philosophy. And when people adopted Stoicism, they were adopted. It generally was a religion for the middle classes, for the intellectual classes, right? People who were sort of dissatisfied with religious ritual, dissatisfied with a lot of the mythologies that characterized religious worldviews, wanted a religion that appealed to the mind, wanted a philosophy, right, that was not only concerned with knowledge, but concerned with human well-being. And Stoicism satisfied that fundamental intellectual and spiritual yearning of people within the Hellenistic world. Its competitor was Epicureanism, and Paul also makes reference to the Epicureans. Epicurus was born also around the time of Zeno, 342 BC. He was a follower of Democritus, so he was an atomist. He was a materialistic thinker. Unlike the Stoics, they were not concerned with any world soul, right? With an underlying principle that one can detect in the nature of being, with the rationality of the cosmos. They were not concerned with that. They couldn't see that, right? They were radical materialists, but they also felt that a philosophy that was satisfying to the mind of a Roman or Greek intellectual must be a philosophy that provided guidance for living, not only an understanding of the nature of reality, but certainly a guidance for living. Yeah, there has been a break in the recording, but I'm continuing. Yeah, so that the Epicureans were very much concerned with the nature and the quality of human life, human existence. They rejected the notion, right, of, in fact, they said if they are gods at all, right, then they are comprised of atoms also. The soul, the human soul, if it exists, is also has an atomic structure, right? So they were really, really rigid materialists. They embraced the system, as I said, of Democritus. One of the things that they tried to do, however, was to liberate men from the fear of the gods and the fear of death and the fear of evil spirits and so on. They felt that, you know, there should be an emancipation of the human mind from many of those superstitions that clouded the mind, right? That provided, you know, there was a source of illusion and very often a source of unhappiness. So they set out to free men's minds from the fear of the gods, because the gods can be very punitive and judgmental in the way in which they handle human beings. But even though they were concerned with providing guidance, one would expect that, you know, such a philosophy would be an eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. But it was not like that. They believed that the pursuit of the individual should be a pursuit of happiness. But that happiness consists in tranquility of mind, in serenity of soul, in physical health, and in the pursuit of intellectual goals, right? People should be restrained, right, from a life of excessive and unbridled pleasure. Again, temperance was the guiding value in their ethic, in their belief about the nature of human well-being. And so they felt that friendship should be cultivated, that one should not live a life of hedonism, 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 and a life of libertarian excess. These are things that should be avoided. So very interesting, you know, the Epicureans got a very bad name eventually. A lot of people associated them with libertarianism, you know, with freedom of expression, with indulgence, hedonistic indulgence. They came to be associated with that. When you study the writers of the Epicureans, of the Epicurean movement, you recognize that these are people who are very much concerned with calm and tranquility and staidness and modesty and so on. So these were some of the dominant philosophical systems that existed in the Hellenistic world, and systems that had a tremendous appeal to a significant proportion of the population. Yes, Aristotle and Plato made a lot of sense, but they did not provide most people with a normative principle for living, with a measure, a system, a formula to achieve quality of human life, right? To enjoy the spiritual benefits that were available to human beings. Many of them did not have an ethical dimension. Stoicism and Epicureanism are significant because of the ethical dimension that they provided, in addition to providing answers to people's intellectual quest. Now, the other systems that I want to refer to are not as significant in many respects as they were. And one is Gnosticism. And again, theology students would be familiar with Gnosticism, certainly at this time, because I think it was in the 1950s that a whole compilation of Gnostic Gospels were found in Egypt, in Nag Hammadi. And that revealed the extent to which Christianity became affected by Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism was really an Eastern, it has an Eastern origin, right? The Gnostics were people who believed that salvation was something that we should pursue. Human beings needed salvation from this world, but the salvation to be achieved could only be achieved through knowledge. Now, there's a sense in which that comes from the original Greek ideas and understanding, right? Greeks believed that when you did wrong things, it was the result of ignorance. And in order to have a world in which people did the right things, in which there was moral rectitude, one had to have knowledge. So it was not an unfamiliar concept in the Greek world, but this was now mystified by the Gnostics, because that knowledge that they were talking about was a knowledge that could only come through a revelation, some revelation from some being, transcendent being. And so the Gnostics looked for a savior for mankind. They believed that the material world was not just, as Plato would have defined it, a world of illusion. They believed that the material world was an evil world. And in fact, there were Gnostic sects outside of Christianity, but there were a number of Gnostic sects within Christianity. And they interpreted the whole Christian gospel essentially to be, right, a revelation of how evil the material world is, and that individuals should seek to pursue that world of spiritual well-being. Those who were Christians accepted Christ as that savior who came to guide us out of materiality and show us the way to true spirituality and true salvation. Gnosticism was very, very prevalent. Not only did it have its source in the Eastern world, in Babylonia and so on, but it became very popular and very prominent in the West. Alexandria, right? Middle Eastern countries, Europe, parts of Greece and so on. Those Gnostic concepts emerged. And I think there are a few hints to them, not only in Paul's writings, but in John's writings also. Some hints made to the presence and the threat of Gnosticism. The Gnosticism was one of the dominant notions, dominant schools of thought that characterized that Hellenistic period. And then there was a Platonism that developed after Plato. Very interesting. And a lot of it emerged from a book that he wrote called the Timaeus. The Timaeus is a very interesting book because it deals with the origin of things, right? The creation of the world by a demiurge. This new Platonism was very much concerned with these ontological issues. In a way, it was linked to Pythagoreanism. It took on a very religious character, just as Gnosticism would have done. It took on a very religious character. And it began to speak about God in a threefold manner, right? And this, interestingly, is at a time before the development of the Trinitarian doctrine in the early Christian church. There's a supreme Godhead, and they came up with a very interesting notion, right, that there was a world soul. Again, as a concept that could be easily associated with the Stoics, the doctrine of ecstasy, right? That spiritual development and growth, right, is something that is a mystical experience, the result of a mystical experience. And ultimately, one has to achieve a certain kind of mystical ecstasy in order to catch a glimpse of truth and of the divine, and to establish one's relation to that world soul, and so on. There were a host of intermediary beings in that Neoplatonic world. They believed in a body-soul dualism, right? The immortality of the soul. They accepted the Stoic notion of the brotherhood of man and the need for a cosmopolitan kind of civilization. So that new Platonism, that whole philosophical system was one that was really gaining ascendancy, even more than the original Platonism, because it had that semi-cultic character, right? Semi-religious character, seemed to offer a better way of life to human beings. And then there's Neoplatonism, and the founder of Neoplatonism, he was born in Egypt, Alexandria, somewhere around the early 3rd century, 203 AD or something like that. And he was Plotinus, right? His system was an interesting system also, because it really added to the Platonic system a new kind of ontology, a notion that, God is that ultimate transcendent being, right? But that the whole universe is an emanation of God, right? The general Judeo-Christian belief is that God is transcendent and he creates the universe, but he is separate and distinct from his universe. He can intervene at any time within that universe, but he's separate and distinct from that universe. Neoplatonism said something very different. And what it argued was that the universe emanates from God. In fact, the first emanation is thought to be thought itself. And that is where the Platonism is, that notion of the intelligible world that Plato talked about. The nous, N-O-U-S, right? That emanates first from God, and out of that, there's a further emanation, right? The world soul or the demiurge, right? And we are also implicated in that. So our individual souls are bound up with the world soul or the demiurge. There is an afterlife, and we guaranteed existence in that afterlife. He wrote a very interesting book called the Enneads, right? And in the Enneads, he expounds his system of thought, his notion, right, his notion of the world soul and its emanation from the nous, which ultimately emanates from the divine being. So Neoplatonism was a very, very interesting kind of philosophical system. And so the Hellenistic world was, in a way, it was filled with a lot of intellectual quest, intellectual activity. People were really coming up with all kinds of ideas. Many of them originating from, in fact, there were a lot of ideas coming out of places like Persia and so on. When we come to the Middle Ages, and I have to speak about somebody like Augustine, I could talk about Manichaeism. Manichaeism is very similar to Gnosticism, which it radically bifurcates reality into an evil natural world and a good world, right, of transcendent being. There's a radical dichotomy between them. And Manichaeism was also one of the new religions that became quite popular, right, in the Hellenistic environment. So basically, Hellenism is a very important moment in the development of that Western philosophical system. And it lays the foundations for what is going to happen in the Middle Ages. But a lot of medieval philosophy is a philosophy that will hark back to that Hellenistic environment within which its foundation was laid. Right? A lot of those ideas would have been in circulation, and those ideas would be appropriated by the new Christian thinkers, right, who would now try to expound the faith in as enlightened a manner as possible. I'm using philosophical ideas, I'm not departing from fundamental religious beliefs, right, but synthesizing those two worlds in a kind of new intellectual construct or harmony that would be satisfying to the human mind. And so I will end there today with the Hellenists, right? A very important period in Western history. I would suggest that you look at the notes and that you go to your sources on the internet to read up about Hellenistic culture.